All right, let's go ahead and get started. I just wanted to say a few words before I introduce Alex. One thing John Cochran just said, people who are in the peanut gallery should feel free to come down and take some of the seats down here. I just wanted to give a little advertisement for what's up. So first of all, this is going to be the last talk of the winter quarter. Got a great lineup for spring quarter. We're going to start off on April 1st with a rousing debate about industrial policy, interdisciplinary debate about industrial policy. And Steve Davis will be one of the panelists on that. And then we have a number of other good talks during the spring. We don't have every slot full, in large part because John and I both are traveling often on the same day there, but we still have something like 5, maybe 6 talks in. So just to let you know that. So for today, finishing off the winter quarter, we're happy to have Alexander Zentefis talking about a century of inflation narratives.
Thank you, Valerie. Thanks everyone for attending in person and also online. This is a highly interdisciplinary work. We have 7 people on the project. The first 4 are all PhD students. We're all from different backgrounds. Murad, he's a computer scientist. He's at Chicago. Jing Chang, he's a computational linguist. He's at Northwestern. Sam and Giannis are both here at Stanford. They're economists. Rob, Chen-Hao, and I are faculty. Rob's also a computational linguist. Chen-Hao's a computer scientist focusing on natural language processing, and I'm also an economist. So it kind of goes to show you that this is a type of work that tries to bring in different ideas, textual analysis, computational linguistics, monetary economics, to think about narratives, and particularly inflation narratives. And one thing I also want to preface is that it's still very early stage work. And so a lot of it is still things that we're trying to figure out and decide on what's the best approach. But this is the right time for comments and feedback because it gives us a chance to revise and to push the paper forward. So I'm from the Chicago style. That's where I grew up. So feel free to interject anytime, be as tough as you can. I'll respond as best I can, but this is still early stage work and we know that there's some holes in it. So inflation narratives, what I hope, the main thing I want you to take away from today is really what is a narrative, because I think there is some confusion about what precisely a narrative is if we think about it distinctively from the literary tradition or from novels compared to bringing that idea to economics. And so there is actually a growing literature just for motivation, arguing that narratives influence beliefs, behaviors, and policy decisions. There's some early paper by Abalafia, and actually from 2010, in an organizational behavior paper that talked about the Fed in particular. And I'll touch on the Fed a little bit, and how the Federal Reserve members try to come up with narratives to make sense of their policy decisions. Bob Shiller, probably in one of the more famous works, actually is both an article and a book about narrative economics. And he argues that narratives do actually influence people's decisions and their beliefs. But he didn't really precisely define a narrative. It was more colloquially described as a story, how we think about stories in economics and that influence people's beliefs, and these stories can be contagious. Now, more work has thought about narratives and tried to think about a definition as how they provide these interpretive frameworks of envisioning the real world and how we make sense of complex economic environments like Barron and Freeze, 2023, and Akerlof and Snower. But I think it really is important to have a precise definition of a narrative so that there's not ambiguity, because that's what we're going to actually use to operationalize that idea when we think about the data and inflation narratives. So narratives, what are they? Schiller said they're stories. Now, if you go back to the literary form, back in 1967, there was a famous paper from Laboff and Leletsky that describes narratives as temporal accounts of events. There's a time dimension to it. And then actually there's an AR paper from 2020 that tries to formalize this in a mathematical model, where Elias and Spiegler, they treat them as a causal explanation of events, where agents in the model, they see data, and there's different causal explanations, specifically directed acyclic graphs. A causes B causes C, and they define that as a narrative. And I think the literature is sort of coalescing around this idea, where what's key to a narrative is not just a story or plot of characters as it is in the literary form, but at least when it comes to economics, a narrative is really defined by causality. What causes what, and what are the consequences of that effect? So we, in this paper, focus on inflation. We don't have to focus on inflation. There are many different topics or subject economics that narratives can be applied to. And we hope that perhaps this infrastructure we developed can be applied to other ideas in both micro and macro. But there's some work that does talk about stories and framing of information as it relates to inflation and people's beliefs. I'll focus on this Koybin, Gordon-Achenko, and Weber paper. That's very interesting because we find sort of contradictory results, even though it's a different design. Or what they do is they ran an RCT, they sent out surveys where they present respondents with information from the Federal Reserve directly, and then also an account from USA Today, the media, about what the Fed said. And they find, in fact, that direct accounts from the Fed do shift expectations of these survey respondents, but the newspaper's effects are also shift expectations, but by about half. We find sort of the opposite in the data, where direct Fed communications, at least this is observational, there's more RCT, so it's causal, where the media seems to have a bigger impact on predicting expectations, while the direct Fed communication seems to have less of an impact. But again, it just sort of think about a base of comparison. It's different designs. I don't want to make too much of a deal of it, just that people are thinking about this issue about how framing of information affects people's beliefs. Alan?
Just a clarification, does a narrative need to be pushed for the narrative, or because you can have a certain way of describing something, but it doesn't stick?
Yeah. So
what's your definition? What persuasion? How much persuasion needs matter for becoming a narrative?
So for us, we're not going to take a stance on the persuasiveness content of it, but just the cause and effects component. Schiller would argue that certain narratives stick and they become contagious, others don't, but there's also narratives. And so some become very popular and they become contagious and they spread, others don't, but they're all narratives. So we're going to take the stand that, and I'll give the definition formally, that a narrative is just a causal relationship. Whether it sticks or not, whether it's contagious is a different story. Okay, so as I mentioned, narratives are not simply descriptions of why, at least when it comes to inflation, description of why prices change, but explanations of why they change and what the consequences follow. And so our strict definition of an inflation narrative is an explanation of the causes and or effects of inflation. And that's what distinguishes a narrative from news. And that's actually going to be two distinct concepts that we'll think about. Okay, so what do we ask? Again, in the Chicago style, just in case anyone has to leave early, what do we ask? What do we find? And then we'll just go into the details. So a lot of the paper is descriptive, really just thinking about how have these inflation narratives evolved in American newspapers. That's the focus of media that we're going to be thinking about. We're lacking social media. We don't have radio. We don't have TV, but that could easily be extended or thought about. We're just focused on newspapers. Also predictive, do specific narrative types predict inflation expectations by demographic groups? There's no causality here, just predictive, it's all correlations. We're trying to think about ways where we can actually get some causal inference. And this third part was something that John Cochran had mentioned, be interesting to think about, is the Fed, the role of the Fed's narratives. How are they distinct from the media narratives? How have they evolved? Does the media amplify or suppress what the Fed says via their more direct-facing, public-facing communications? And then can they directly predict public expectation of inflation compared to the media? So what do we find? In terms of the evolution, just more descriptively, fiscal causes, and I'll lay out exactly what I mean by the ontology of these narratives, the cause and effects. They tend to dominate pre-1980 by far, but then afterward, once Volcker took over, more supply and monetary causes gained prominence in the media at least. And you can actually do evolution by space, where we'll have the headquarters of the newspapers, and we can divide them into Democratic voting areas versus Republican voting areas, and it's just unconditionally of the full 100-year sample. Democratic leaning areas tend to focus on monetary causes and some savings effects. Savings means more effects on the financial markets and how people shift their savings from bonds or stocks. While Republican leaning areas, newspapers headquartered in those areas, tend to focus on fiscal causes of inflation and cost of living effects.
Jumping ahead, but
yeah.
In the popular narratives, relative prices as caused to inflation seem to be really popular. It's price gouging and the great chicken conspiracy and oil price shocks and so forth. They're coming up.
So the
monetary or fiscal.
Yeah, so the more unconventional ones, we'll call those other. So the relative prices, the market concentration, that'll be other. Well, I'll show you the ontology or the definitions. Those will come up, but they tend to be a relatively small fraction of the narratives, yeah. Now, that's just descriptive, the evolution. I'll show you some pretty time series pictures. Prediction, this is just running inflation expectations from the Michigan survey, household level, on just the shares of inflation narratives. There seems to be some strong predictive power, even controlling for past inflation, realized inflation, and inflation news, or just the log number of sentences, but primarily for lower income households, not so much for higher income households. And maybe there's a story about sophistication, less reliance on the media, more reliance on other signals when they form expectations. We don't have a good explanation, but it's possible that media framing of information about inflation does contribute in part to, there is a pretty wide gap in terms of inflation expectations between lower income households and higher income households and reality, where everyone tends to overestimate inflation, the level of inflation, but higher income households tend to do it less, lower income households tend to do it more. And finally, the guidance part, this is the Fed part, this is the more, this is the newest stuff. This is, again, more descriptive monetary framing from the Fed. This is looking at all public facing documents, speeches, testimonies, the Fed minutes, the transcripts when they're released. Congressional testimonies, they tend to focus on monetary causes, pre-Volcker, and then post-Volcker is a little more balanced and diversified, supply rates, uncertainty. Now I think about transmission, or what the Fed says, how does that transmit into the media and ideally into household expectations? They tend to attenuate, the media tends to attenuate the Fed narratives on average, but monetary tends to pass through the most strongly. And finally, do the Fed narratives directly predict inflation expectations of households? They do, but a little bit less strongly than the media directly, which is sort of in contrast to that earlier JP paper that shows that, in fact, the Fed communicates directly has more of a shift on household expectations than the media's representation, but just looking at USA Today. Okay.
Why are these framed as the Fed versus the media? I could imagine it might depend on the Fed chair, context in which this is happening. You haven't really said anything about that yet.
Yeah, I think absolutely. So the nice thing about the Fed, this is still early stage. We have the speaker of every sentence, and so we can look more deeply into different eras, into who the speaker is, different types of monetary policy, depending on who the speaker was. There is for sure an interrelation between the media and the Fed.
But one view might be that, and this is, I'm endorsing this view, just stating it, that it's important for the Fed to communicate its view to the public, and that depends a lot on the persuasive power of the Fed chair.
Yes.
So that view would then inform who you might select as a Fed chair.
Yeah, I think we can do some more in terms of conditioning on who the speaker is to see if that has more predictive power in terms of inflation expectations. If we think about where the Fed may have the most power in terms of shifting expectations, is thinking more about who the actual speaker is, rather than just treating the Fed as one entity, as we do now. Yeah, John?
It seems to me there's a lot of endogeneity here.
There is.
How do you deal with that?
So far, that's why all we can say is correlation. Now, it's going to be hard. We're thinking about ways to empirically get some causal inference, which we don't have now. You can think of this, I mean, I'd like you to think of this as a complex endogenous structural model, which is that there's the media that has its own objectives. They want to optimize readership, and they could shift their framing and their narratives in order to increase eyeballs and get attention. There's the Fed who's thinking about direct communication to households and how they interpret information, and also the Fed thinking about how the media can translate that. And all of that is in one model. We don't have that model written down. We're thinking about how we could think of either writing down a structural model or thinking of some sort of exogenous shocks that we can use to exploit in order to get causal inference. But right now it's just correlations at this stage.
Well, not everything has to be causal. You can view it just as information gathering. It's a huge amount of information out there. And, if suppose narratives were perfect, it was the oil price shock because people say it's the oil price shock. And now you can forecast inflation in a way that you couldn't unless you had, 10,000 variables in the VAR, which you could never have. So, you see coming. But so why should narratives affect prediction is, I think, that is a harder question. Inflation comes, Elizabeth Warren says, it's the grocery stores are price gouging. That tells me why we had inflation. It doesn't, maybe that makes me think, that's transitory, it'll go away, as opposed to more permanent if it was monetary fiscal policy. But not obvious how the first order would be to change. So even if you have, if you don't have a strong result there, I'm not necessarily bothered by that fact.
Yeah, I think there's another thing I forgot to mention, which is that from an economics perspective, how I want folks to think about narratives are really models of the world, economic models. And it's how we interpret data, and that could shift expectations. So that AER paper explicitly does that, which is that agents in the model, they see data and they can form different narratives, which are effectively models, and that influences what expectations they have about future data realizations. And so if folks have different models of the world, they have different narratives that drive their beliefs, that could shift their interpretation of what can happen in the future.
Yeah, and a narrative, here comes a huge inflation, and that narrative takes over. That could actually, you might want to forecast the Fed. So it's very clear the Fed's narrative affects what it's going to do with interest rates. And that was just screaming at us in 2020. Their narrative was this is a transitory relative price supply shock, which will go away. So we'll sit on our hands and do nothing.
Exactly. Yeah.
It might forecast short-term interest rates better than it forecasts actual inflation.
Yeah, so the Fed piece I think is interesting. It's interesting to think about policy, and that's the one that we want to dig deeper into, but also sort of the interplay between the Fed and the media, and understanding that Fed communications aren't always, they may want to be direct. When I was working at the Fed, I saw that meticulous amount of time that they folks spend in picking the exact words they want to say in the announcement, but ultimately it could be filtered through the media, and taking that into account is important for the Fed.
So let's talk about that tariff inflation that gets discussed a lot, which, I would say tariffs are a relative price change. But you would say that no, there's a bunch of people out there who think they're inflationary. To the extent that they aren't, that those people then change their expectations, they behave differently, and maybe they start buying ahead of time or something, driving, which increases demand, and they change their behavior. The Fed then reacts, and so that's what you're getting at, is like, there can be a false narrative that affects behavior, and and that is important to understand, as opposed to Milton Friedman's statement that inflation is always everywhere a monetary phenomenon, or John's statement that fiscal theory of the price level. I mean, we need a deep understanding of what causes general increases in all prices, which is inflation.
Yeah.
But so I'm trying to understand, like, if there's a false narrative out there, price gouging, tariffs, oil price shocks, all of these things are shocks to the economy. And then it's the monetary and fiscal authority's responsibility to look at those shocks and set policy. But ultimately, inflation is in the policymakers' domain of how they have increased the nominal things in the economy, because that ultimately that's the only thing that will lead to a general increase in price level.
So we're not going to take a stance on true or false narratives. We're going to the main ontology. When I say ontology, I just mean the dictionary of causes and effects, are just things that we think are guided by theory, or at least in textbooks, or at least online as well. But people can have their own theory of inflation that they believe is the correct one. We're just kind of seeing what the landscape of the media says as to what's causing inflation and what are the effects of inflation, without taking a true stand on what a true
economists disagreed. In the 1960s, there was a lot of demand pull, cost push, inflation discussion, which didn't really go anywhere.
So we'll try to account for that as well. And it's quite possible that false narratives or narratives that are based on relative prices, or even folks have difficulty thinking about price levels versus price changes, that could influence expectations. Then we're to see, at least from the narrative account, does that shift? Does that predict change in expectations, without taking a stance on it should or it shouldn't? So the rest of the talk, I don't know if I'll get through everything. I'll try. Just a lot of his methodology, just how do we extract these narratives from papers, is using some more advanced natural language processing techniques, using large language models. And then it's evolution, just descriptive through time and space, how these things have evolved. And the predictive regressions of the media narratives on inflation expectations at the household level. And finally, information on the Fed, sort of repeating the exercises, but focusing on the Fed documents, more the public-facing ones. So the newspaper data, it's a database called ProQuest, commonly used in economics. It's US newspapers, 1923 to 2025, 50 states and DC and Guam, so it covers the full nation. There's 789 unique newspapers. It's national ones, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and also local ones like the Pittsburgh Post or the Detroit Free Press. There's some interesting dynamics between national and local papers that we're kind of digging into, but at least for now, we're going to include all of them in the analysis, both national and local. So this is inflation sentences. This is a count of the number of sentences in the database that mention the word inflation. And first I'll describe the picture, and then I'll describe why we focus on sentences. So you can see just from 1923 to 2025, there's a lot of variation. You see big spikes around certain economic events like the oil crisis, inflation, or the Volcker disinflation, the financial crisis, or really the big spike in post-COVID. You need to note this is not this is not conditional on the number of articles. So coverage is increasing over time. And so this is not taking a ratio of the number of articles in the database, which you perhaps would have a more balanced picture compared to the post-COVID, where there's a lot of discussion of inflation. So the thing that we'll do is actually that when we think about inflation narratives, we'll focus at the sentence level. So we'll pick out a particular sentence and then ask, is there a narrative there? And if there is, what is it? Now you could say, well, why the sentence and not the article or a paragraph? A narrative could be developed over a series of sentences, and you easily could do the whole at the article level or the paragraph level. The advantage of the sentence level, it measures sort of the intensity of the narrative, how often it's brought up, and maybe that's a nice measure. While at the article level, perhaps it's more of an extensive margin, just it's brought up at all. We can try both. We are exploring more at the article level, expanding the sort of the unit of observation from a sentence to a paragraph or an article. For the talk and what we have so far is at the sentence level. So looking at a sentence, and as I described the methodology, is there a narrative there? If there is, which one is it? This is more of an intensive measure of sort of these types of narratives and at least inflation news.
Possible that inflation gets referred to in different ways in the past? Like,
great question. Yeah, so it's quite possible. So we have data that goes back to the 1920s, and there almost certainly was a shift in vocabulary. We don't have good evidence yet. We haven't dug deep enough yet into quantifying that shift. We use the word inflation. That would capture disinflation. We're missing other keywords like price rising, price lowering. The other thing that we're missing is co-references. So for example, you could have a sentence where there's an error, or it's the inflation sentence that has the word inflation, but then the next sentence has the word it. They say inflation's going up, and then it is caused by blah, 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 blah. So we'd miss that case. And so this co-reference problem is also a thing that we have to think about, and also just shifts in the vocabulary over time and how inflation is conceptualized.
At the LLMs do pronoun subbing?
What's that?
Pronoun subbing?
We can, yeah. So we're trying to quantify that co-reference problem. It's called co-reference, where there's a subject, but then it's referenced by a pronoun subsequently. Yeah.
So you didn't include deflation or disinflation?
So disinflation would be included because it contains the word inflation, but not deflation. Yeah. And this gets actually into how we actually extract these narratives. And again, think of these as models of the world, models of inflation. These are these narratives, cause and effect relationships. So at the sentence level, first we just filter the ProQuest data based on all sentences that have the word inflation. And then we ask, does it have a narrative? If so, what narrative? And as John mentioned, we don't have deflation. We don't have prices up, prices down. There are other approaches to this. We could be more expansive. It's really trading off precision or signal versus noise, where this is a highly precise signal where you know it's about inflation. While if you expand the keyword set to think about what sentence you include, it could include some more noise, but it captures potentially a little more signal. But for right now, it's very, very precise. It has to have the word inflation. Now, the thing I'll say also is that we have labeled the direction. Is inflation going up, going down? Also the timing. So is it past, talking about past inflation, current inflation, or future inflation? In the analysis we're doing now, I'm not conditioning on that, whether it's up, down, the direction, or the timing. It's just, does it have the word inflation, and then does it have the narrative, yes or no? But we have capacity to actually think about, is it talking about historical inflation, the sentence, current inflation, or future inflation, and the direction up or down? Inevitably, we'd have to come up with the narratives. And we did it, as I call it, a top-down approach, where we pre-specify the narratives, pre-specify the causes and the effects. These are the ones that we pre-specify. Some may favor some over others. I know one person in favor number 5. But one is demand, which is just excessive demand outstripping supply. That's a cause of inflation. Another one is supply or oil price shocks or supply constraints or supply chain problems. That's a cause of inflation. Wages or wage price spirals, just the labor market being very tight, that can cause inflation. Monetary, central bank policies being a cause of inflation. Fiscal, maybe the one that should be it. Government spending or excess deficits is the cause of inflation. Expectations, which is self-fulfilling. People expect inflation to be higher, and that actually causes them to change behavior and hence cause inflation to rise. International factors, this could be trade or global factors, tariff policy, and then other, which is other cause of inflation. This could be things that were brought up earlier, maybe something about market concentration, price gouging, things like that could show up under other. Effects, a little bit more, reduced purchasing power. This is the effects on the dollar. Cost of living increases, has higher living costs from inflation. Higher inflation causes higher economic uncertainty. Interest rates, which is what the central bank will do. Now, this is a little bit biased because we're focusing on one particular policy tool that really wasn't adopted until the 1980s, while there are other monetary policy tools that for that period. And so we're thinking maybe we should refine that, or at least expand it to think about other tools the Fed use as a consequence of inflation, try to combat it. It's also connected to monetary, where there's this feedback effect where inflation could be high, because of monetary policies, but then the Fed reacts to it and through interest rates, and then that becomes an effect. So there's a correlation there. Redistribution, income or wealth redistribution effects. Savings, that's what really the financial markets, which is impacts on people's savings or the bond market or the stock market. Competitive implications, cost push on businesses, change their behavior. The social or political impact of inflation, and finally, impact on government policies or public finances, the government budget. And then there's other inflation effects like changing menu costs, like it's gonna be harder for people to change their menus. Now, this is one approach. I will say that there are other approaches. We could have gone keywords, which is you just think about, okay, what are the categories that I think fit for cause and effects? And I'll just look at keywords. And if people are interested, I can jump to a slide that actually shows that there is some information value added to focusing on like a causal relationship as opposed to just picking out keywords and sentences. Another approach is you let the data decide, which is you say, okay, here's a sample of sentences, and you ask a model to try to extract independently what those narratives are. We did that as well, and it turns out that they're actually very, very similar to these. Some are overlap, and nothing's new. And so what a model does is that we fed it 10,000 sentences, and we asked it try to extract narratives, cause and effect relationships, and we did it iteratively because initially it's going to extract about 10,000 of them, and then you keep on refining it.
You have to tell us how it is that it's separating out cause and effect. You haven't said anything about that yet.
I will. Yeah, I will. It's just the beginning. This is the ontology. But this is just another approach. This is the top-down approach. What I was describing was the bottom-up, which is prompting it. And then we didn't do that. But if people are interested, I can talk about that. But this is what we did. So these are the categories. This is an example of a sentence where the top one is not a narrative. It's just a statement of fact. A year ago, the administration assumed inflation would run at 7.5% in 1979. No narrative there. That's how it'd be classified. The second sentence would have two narratives. If these fiscal policies materialize, they're likely to boost economic growth and spur inflation, potentially forcing the Fed to hike interest rates more quickly to keep up. So in this case, we would label it as a fiscal factor being the cause, and then rates or the Fed response being an effect.
Mechanically, you still haven't told us what you're doing.
Right.
You say you label it. You're not reading all these. So
right.
What in fact is happening?
Here's some more examples, but I can jump to this, Steve. So this is what we do. So we train a large language model at the end of the day. So we train this large language model to do two things. To first detect if a sentence has a narrative, and then also to classify it in a multi-class classification into which narrative. So we use an off-the-shelf model. It's an open source, Llama 3.1. Now it's outdated. These models are advancing so quickly. And so what we did is we annotated, 3 of us, 2,000 sentences, not about 1,000 from the historical period, 1960, 1980, and about 1,000 from a contemporary period, 2010, 2023. We didn't go back in the 1920s, but that is something we're thinking about. And then that's a training set. And so 3 of us manually annotated these sentences into these categories. And it could be a cause, it could be effect, it could be both, it could be none. And then we have a test set because we use that the 2,000 sentences to first train the model, but then you have to test how good the model is at actually labeling this. Because as Steve said, we're not going to label 4.5 million sentences. We're going to have a model do that. But you need a test set to evaluate how good it is at actually labeling. And so for a test set, we had about 700 sentences, about 500 from the historical 1960, 1980 period, and about 200 from the more modern 2010 to 2023 period. So that's the actual mechanics, that's the methodology of how we extract these narratives. It's effectively a classification exercise.
Show us some performance metrics. Okay.
Right here. So annotation. So this is just like at the starting point. This is 3 of us were annotating. This gets to how reliable is the training set. And on 97% of the sentences, at least 2 of us agreed. And majority rule determined what was the ground truth. And so if 2 out of 3 of us agreed on the full set, all cases, the cause and effect, et cetera, then that would count as the ground truth. That would count as the gold label. But then there's inter-annotator disagreement where we didn't agree on everything. And about 90% of the time, we agreed on whether the sentence contained a narrative. So on this, the binary ask, does this contain a narrative or not? About 90% of the time we agreed. There's a more formal kappa in this literature about how you think about that. It's close to that number, but just in colloquial terms, think about 90% of the time, all 3 of us agreed on whether or not there's a narrative. And 60-80% of the time, all 3 of us agreed on the category. And this is all categories, whether it's just one or multiple. It's pretty good. The 90 is very good. The 68, mean, you'd like a little bit higher. 60 is almost a threshold, but so it's moderate agreement. But these things are quite nuanced, and so that's really the source of disagreement when it comes to the annotation. But this is setting up the training to then show the model. Okay, this is what I want you to think about when you're thinking of how to correctly classify sentences into these narratives.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, one question. I'm assuming the base rate is not going to be up to 71. Whereas
The
base rate for your most common category.
mhm.
The other thing that's kind of jumping out is why is it that 68% of the time the humans are agreeing on which narrative category, but models predicting 71% of the time the right category?
All three of us.
Is that the 71% applying only to the ones where the humans agree?
This is the test set. So the 87 and 71 is on the test set.
But it says assigns the right category 71% of the time. What's the definition of right when the humans don't agree?
And it's the majority rule.
The majority.
So
rule.
2 out of 3.
Okay. And I'm a little surprised by you have many categories.
Mhm.
Okay. And I presume some of these categories on either the cause and effect time only show up 2 or 3 times in your annotated set.
This is
In
quite
the-
in
in the-
2000. It's at
But I
least probably
presume-
10
well,
times.
It'd be nice to show us the distribution
Yeah, that's
of what
fair
that
point.
looks like in the
Yeah.
human sample.
Mhm.
Because my experience trying to do similar things is this works great when you have a large training data set.
Yeah.
For each category.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing in some of your categories, you have very little training data, which is a little surprising that the model can do well in those cases. But maybe it's all loaded on a few small number of categories,
Mhm.
which is why it's doing reasonably well.
Yeah, so certainly the prevalence is highest for a few, fiscal, monetary, supplier by far. There are some that are quite low, like social is quite low. So that could be just the predominant ones is driving the high hit rate. But I agree, yeah, we can show
It'd
that.
be nice to show us the false
Yeah.
positive, false negative rates by these categories and see
Yeah.
whether, in fact, my conjecture is you're doing a pretty good job on the common categories and you're not doing so good
Mhm.
on the less common categories. That's
Yeah.
just a conjecture and it's easy to test.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, we can easily show that. So the model performance, as Steve had talked about, it's this is looking at how well the model did on this test set of the 700 sentences. About 80% of the time, it nailed whether there's a narrative and then the right category about 71% of the time. So decent performance. Obviously, you want higher. And what was nice is that it's robust across time periods, where we didn't see a drop in performance when you're thinking about the 1960, 1980 era versus the 2010 to 2023 era. And we did at the end of the day is, okay, we have the model fine-tuned. Again, you're just trying to make sure that you adjust the parameters of the model so that it classifies this correctly. And then we apply that model to 4.2 million sentences across the full sample period. Then what we have is that for every sentence, we've sort of categorized them into these narrative buckets.
2 comments here. One,
Yeah.
to the extent that you're interested to get an unbiased coefficient of the correlation, you can actually use the false positives and false negatives. And like in the 1990s, there's this like instrument regression.
Mhm.
But the other question I was kind of curious, you were talking earlier about the difficulty to get causality. Could you run your LLM multiple times to get a classical instrument variable with measurement error for the narrative? I feel like that shouldn't work, but
On the measurement error?
no, the first one was straight, was
Yeah.
more textbook, but the second one is more. There's a literature from 2SLS where you
Mhm.
take a variable on the right hand side and measure the error, get another measurement of it, and then that is an instrument variable.
That's clever. I haven't thought about that, no. There is, I mean, going back, there is an inherent issue econometrically whenever we use large language models or any type of model to classify, is that the measurement error is non-random. And that's going to bias coefficients. And the issue, there are actually techniques around that we're working on that effectively what it does is a doubly robust regression, which is you include in the regression the model's predictions, but also human labeled predictions or human labeled cases that you know are true. And you combine the two, and that's how you run the regression. It's a growing literature, and we are planning to do this as a robustness check, but know that whenever we work with these models, they're bound to have classification errors or measurement errors, and so there are ways around that to deal with that issue. I haven't heard of this IV thing though, or this IV approach.
Are you using the model for the entire historical period back to 1923?
We are, yeah.
So do you worry that you can agree on the present and the recent past, but as you get into the more distant past, you know less about it, therefore are more likely to disagree. If you have any thoughts on that?
We have thought about it. It is quite possible that vocabulary did shift from the 20s to the 1960s. And what we have not done yet, that is on our to-do list, is actually to quantify the amount of measurement error in that really earlier period. And then if it's high, then retrain the models that includes information from that period so that it's not out of domain, so to speak. We're not using the model, training the model on some data that we then apply it to other data outside of that training. So that's the methodology. Now, the next set is just more descriptive, which is just how these narratives evolved over time. And so this is just from the media again, just breaking up into aggregate categories of causes and effects, where in the pre-World War II period and leading up to World War II, there's a much more emphasis on causes of inflation, but that's been secularly downward trending ever since, and more of an emphasis on effects of inflation. And you can see the spike up around COVID, where there's a big increase in the effects of inflation. Now we'll talk about that, particularly the cost of living, and then a slight decrease ever since then. And then the three most prominent categories, fiscal, it turns out to be very, very predominant in the 1930s, 1940s, pre-war and during the war, and then declining ever since. You do see a bit of a spike post-COVID. Monetary causes, and then supply effects. The causes of like supply shocks, for example, has been pretty persistent.
That might be just because it's true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in World War II, inflation had a lot to do with fiscal policy and not so much to do with the Fed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Vietnam War, Korean War, I see the three.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
COVID war.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then effects, savings, which I want you to think about just effects on financial markets or people's savings, how they shift from bonds, stocks, or vice versa. Rates, which is the Federal Reserve reacts to inflation, trying to change rates, and the cost of living. Those are the three most prevalent. You can see rates really picks up post 1980, not surprising because we sort of restricted the monetary policy tool to change the interest rates as opposed to other monetary policy tools that don't show up before that period as much. And then saving, there's almost a cyclicality to the rates where right before a recession, it tends to spike up, then it drops. We're not quite sure how to interpret that. And then cost of living, you see a big spike up post-COVID inflation, whereas a lot of discussion about the cost of living effects of inflation in that period.
When you're saving, you're saying just prospective returns. I would have thought, we wiped out 20% of bondholders' wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Or the ex-post transfers would have been a big deal.
From the government, you mean? Or
just the ex-post effective inflation on people who held government bonds and also mortgages. Just
that should be captured by savings. Yeah, I can actually, let me take a step back to show you some of these examples where demand. So I gave you some. So demand, I have one for everything, but these are sort of just representative of what these different types of cause categories are. And there's just example sentences. So demand, the takeaway, the economy is not only on solid footing, but could drive inflation higher again as consumers continue to spend their rapidly rising paychecks. Supply, wage, monetary, fiscal. Fiscal, he didn't quite say he knows better than the deficit as a root cause of inflation, but it sort of came out that way. Expect, that's important because consumer expectations are themselves considered a telltale sign of future inflation. When Americans fear their prices will keep accelerating, they will typically rush to buy things sooner. So these are just sort of a flavor of these sentences and how they are implicitly or explicitly stating a causal relationship between something and inflation.
A lot of them, they're talking about the dynamic process of inflation, not sort of a root cause, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Cost of living a consequence?
Cost of living is a consequence.
Why?
We saw that as inflation's impact on the cost of living.
That is what the peasants with pitchforks are out there angry about.
The media frequently says things that are tautological. Is this tautological or not?
People like to hear stories that your labor.
Can you have inflation without it not having an effect on the?
Almost surely no. Yeah, but it's just what's being emphasized.
Is this a causal statement?
This is an effect. So this is effects of inflation.
Yeah, but it's a causal effect. You're saying.
Well, I guess
Narrative is a causal effect. Can a tautological statement state a causal effect?
Not totally tautological, because if real wages, most things about price
cost of living.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was trying to rescue something sensible.
No, I went through that in my head and I was about to say it, but then I realized that he's absolutely right. It's just a different way to say it. But but I think people understand cost of living, the public, better than inflation. So I guess making that link in a story is.
Well, most
Yes,
of
but
these-
is the story a narrative? That's the
Yeah.
question. Is this as an example of a narrative?
Well, would you say that inflation causes the cost of living to go up or go down?
I say that's a causal.
Would you?
Inflation is. the
Yeah,
cost
so in
of
this
living.
case,
I guess the question is this, should this be labeled a narrative? Or it's just a statement of tautology? Should we just take it out of your definition of narrative? That's what I take to be.
the entire cost of living category.
Yeah. Sentences about inflation equals cost of living increases.
It's not real changes in relative prices change the cost of living. I mean,
Yeah.
cost of living is
Yeah.
high in Palo Alto because of a relative price change. And most of these things are sort of, inflation went up because prices went up, is what most of these say. Well,
Well,
that's not right.
fair enough, but I guess I just pose it as a question. Should those be taken away from the narrative category?
I can see an argument for it. We keep them in. So when I say causal, I mean there could be inflation is always the subject. And so monetary or demand could be the cause of inflation, but then inflation itself becomes the cause of something else for the effects. So inflation becomes the cause in the causal relationship for the effects categories. Tautological statements, I mean, to John's point, maybe cost of living could be interpreted as relative prices. And hence, when we're thinking about the general cost of living, that is actually not, that is a story that's different from a change in relative prices affecting cost of living. I will say that it is brought up in terms of effects of inflation a lot. It's one of the most predominant categories that the media thinks about. And it also tends to impact, or at least predict people's inflation expectations. There's a lot of discussion about the cost of living, even holding fixed inflation.
I don't doubt that.
Yeah, I mean, when an inflation report comes out, people say the cost of living is now higher. And that's just a tautology.
Yeah.
I'll say bond prices went up and that's why yields went down.
Yeah, that's another thing. An asset pricing effect is not a tautology. Maybe. You think about interest rates go up because inflation's higher. Nominal interest rates. But we keep it as an effect, but I see the point. We can think about trying to filter out those, but for now, this is what the categories are. But it's a great comment, and yeah, very good food for thought.
Just partly for fun, but I think actually it's got some specification value. You should run John's book through this model, see what it comes back with, but more generally, other authoritative treatments of inflation. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that as long as you have a digital copy of the
We need a
book.
digital, yeah, exactly.
So I just
yeah.
this is partly to help us evaluate what the model is actually doing.
Mhm.
And plus, John would like it.
I mean, if it
All the free advertising. Free copy.
That would actually be a fun, that would be,
Want to
that's,
do that for once.
No, I think, digging under the hood of the model some more and revealing it is helpful. I will say that it does overlap with just straight keywords. And so if you assign each category just keywords, it does have some overlap, but it's pretty much 50%. And there's a lot where keyword-based classification misses a lot of the causal structure that's captured in the LLMs. But I do agree about trying to make it more transparent about what exactly the model's doing with some of these counterexamples. Okay.
Human narratives are so crazy. I'm not sure we should demand that they're not tautologies or that they make any sense. Stories people
Definition.
tell. Stories
definition
people
is
tell
a
are
nicer
zany.
word than
If they
tautology.
think it's causal, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, I mean, that is what we're trying to see is what the media is picking up and expressing. And a lot of us could say that it's not true, right? What their explanations are. But we're trying to see what is it? What are they doing?
Because Powell asked about persuasive.
Yeah.
Most of them are nuts. And, that's just what narratives are one step away from propaganda. And the whole idea is healing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is just what I had mentioned earlier about. Oh, yeah.
Back to the previous graph.
Yeah.
So
This
what's
one?
the explanation for these gigantic spikes we see in purple?
I don't have one yet. Yeah. There's a cyclicality to the mentioning of maybe it's just anticipation of what the Fed will do.
New Fed chair, new president. I can't tell how.
They seem to be clustering around recessions. That's the spikiness, not changes in the chairmanship, the chairwomanship. So it's something about potentially relates to how the
If you plot
economic
the rates
conditions are.
along with the actual Fed funds,
Yeah.
we might see
Yeah, exactly.
what it's about.
And then there's also this tipping point argument that Gladwell, talks about all the time. And I don't know how you would incorporate the conditions that say this is now a tipping point. I don't remember what they are.
Mhm.
I don't know how to incorporate into that?
Yeah, so going back to Paul's point about persuasion and contagiousness, which is that Schiller's thesis was that there is some point at which a narrative just gains so much popularity that it kind of goes everywhere and it becomes contagion. And we're thinking about diffusion like that and how these things diffuse, but it's really hard to capture that because you just through a network and you need to know the network structure and how these things diffuse across newspapers, and it's hard to capture that without knowing the network. But that is a good point about these narratives. Yeah.
But also the increase, the colors are hard to see. The purple is the rates.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of these Ulrike Malmendier kinds of things. A bunch of people lived through the Volcker period, the disinflation. They suddenly, and remember there was the big switch. I was actually taking money and banking at this time, the switch from Friedman's monetary policy growth to interest rate targeting. So then that's why everybody says, oh, that's how monetary policy works. They understand it because they see interest rates. They don't see monetary aggregates. And so then the average level is higher. And then they understand based on their experience that inflation's going, they understand the Taylor rule, 1992. They even were picking up on it even before you wrote your paper, John. But but yeah, they suddenly realized that there was this monetary reaction function. And so then that's why higher inflation leads to higher interest rates.
Yeah, there's a bit of one, I guess, a broader point. There's a bit of a look ahead bias that we're using all the information we've accumulated over 100 years to think about what the cause and effects are. And we haven't thought about just separating it through different eras. And so it's like, for example, they may not have thought about the Fed changing interest rates as a policy tool before 1970 or 1980. And that's why it's not discussed. And it only takes time or for theory to develop. And then that kind of percolates into the media. And so right now that's why I totally agree with you, is that there is a connection between what the theory is and what people's general understanding is and what's reported in the media. And that's why you're probably seeing these patterns, because we picked these particular categories.
But even in economist papers before the 1980s, you just didn't see, reaction function rules, so much talk about interest rates.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
They said reserve requirements, that's what. That was
money growth rules.
Yeah, and money growth rules during the Friedman era. But even before then, they would do reserve requirements, I remember. The discount window, right? So they say the discount window, but they may not say rate.
And the Treasury Fed Accord, was, pegged interest rates until.
Yeah. Interest rates were not something, that's a really good point. So can you go back to
that's why we're thinking about expanding the definition of race, because it's a bit limited. It doesn't think about the other policy tools that were available or the other policy regimes that were available. And that's probably why you see that pattern.
A lot of that, so when they thought of themselves as tightening money supply, interest rates would go up. And, mortgage rates went from 4% to 15% in the blink of an eye in the late 1970s. So people talked about it. Also, earlier in history, they understood interest rates under the gold standard. They were mucking around with interest rates all the time.
So that's why it's definitely being picked up there. But I think that explains the trend you see post 1980, where it became an explicit policy tool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so this is just geographically divided headquarters of newspapers into whether they lean Democrat or Republican in presidential elections based on this data set that's widely available. And we don't quite have an explanation for this or why it's the case, but you have the different categories: causes on the left, effects on the right, and then on the y-axis is percentage point differences between areas that lean Democrat versus Republican and what they tend to emphasize, just their share of these different narratives. So Democratic leaning headquarters of these newspapers tend to emphasize more international factors that cause inflation, less so fiscal factors. Republican leaning ones focus more on fiscal factors. And for effects, Democratic leaning area headquarters of the newspapers tend to emphasize more by about 1.5 percentage points savings or financial market effects, as opposed to the cost of living, which is more emphasized in Republican leaning areas.
And these are highly statistically significant because you have so many observations.
Yeah, you can see those are the 95% error bars there. And those are percentage points in the shares. And you can see just relatively here, these shares sort of range from almost 0 to some all the way to 20%. Likewise here. Okay, and this is interesting. We're thinking about this now, which economic fundamentals shift around these narratives. And so this is a very simple regression, which is running the narrative shares, including the none category, where there's not a narrative to statement, on inflation. Again, very, very simple. We got to dig into this deeper. And what you have is all the non-category means it says the word inflation, but doesn't have a label of a narrative, cause or effect, and the rest of the categories. And the x-axis there is the shift in the narrative share, and that's percentage points, just in decimals. And so what we find, at least initially, is that when there's high inflation, there seems to be a shift away from, or a shift toward, I should say, trying to explain it or trying to identify a narrative. That when there's high inflation or higher inflationary periods, the non-category shrinks. We're not just saying the facts, we're trying to make sense of it. And there's more of a classification toward these either cause or effects, where causes are in blue and effects are in red. Again, we're trying to dig deeper into this, is the relationship between these economic fundamentals, like realized inflation, and the media. What gets reported, what's covered. And it looks as if is that when we have high inflationary periods, the media is trying to make sense of it for the readers. We're trying to attribute cause and effects, reducing the non-category.
Can I make a suggestion? I mean, again, this is partly in the spirit of trying to understand better what the model is doing, but also a slight shift in focus. You could imagine you have a huge number of underlying articles here and sentences to draw from. So there's scope for usefully focusing on segments of your data set. One that would seem productive is to identify episodes in the data, at least in recent decades, when the break-even inflation rate moved a lot. Okay, you can identify that at a daily frequency. And big moves of that sort are going to generate discussions in the newspaper the next day, where there actually is something that they're trying to explain. It'd be interesting to know whether the distribution of cause and effects that come out of that look the same. You, as the human annotators, probably want to read a subset of those because they are high signal, the sense in which they're high signal events within your data set. So there's just a lot to do there to zero in on the relevant episodes where there is something to explain it. It's in the same spirit as your point about high inflation episodes, but it's kind of a much more focused.
Yeah.
Day after the CPI report comes out.
And the break-even inflation rate means then the journalists are going to be trying to explain what happened.
We're trying to do much more high frequency analysis. And I'll talk about the Fed, particularly when the media thinks about how it reports on the Fed, but also these fundamentals too, to see how it sort of gets the economic fundamentals translate. Yeah.
You have all these local newspapers, right? So aren't they getting just AP reports on things and then, just saying what the AP said about the national news and it's not really an independent article?
They used to have actual reporters. And
no, this is a great, it's a great point. So right now it's accumulating all the newspapers, but we're thinking we need to, if we keep the local ones, filter out the AP ones and the news wires because it's going to be redundant. Yeah, or just focus on the nationals because the nationals will, and really the nationals are where most of the action is, at least in the more modern period.
Yeah.
Because there you don't have the newswire problem, the AP problem. You just focus on the national, and they're not just like a repeat observation.
Right.
Yeah, but you're totally right. But for now, we're clumping everything together. Okay, now this here, again, reduced form correlations is OLS predictive regressions about household expectations on inflation narratives. And so why are we doing this? There's just a lot of work about how people form expectations in general, in particular, let's say inflation or on inflation. A lot of good work as like what are the factors that drive people's inflation expectations? Some of it could be just realized past inflation, the experience effects. It could be just consumption bundle changes. They go to the grocery store and what they see there in the aisles is what's shifting them. Or central bank communications, which is sort of where we're nestling, which is how the media frames news or information that's affecting people's expectations. That's that employment paper. Now, the channel we're trying to think about is narrative framing, which is the stories that the media says, the cause and effect relationship. Does that have an impact on people's expectations? Does it shift it? Is there a question online? Yeah, go ahead.
With a couple of points. First point is the word inflation. In the 20s and 30s in the academic literature, it didn't mean rising prices. It meant growing money and credit. I don't know what it was in everyday usage, but that's something that needs to be checked on. The most famous example of that was Hayek saying you couldn't lower unemployment with a little bit of inflation. What he meant was monetary expansion. The second point, just an observation, this sudden emphasis on interest rates after about 1980. In popular opinion. In the academic literature, the Fisher effect of expected inflation on interest rates was around, but very little discussed. And then suddenly in the 1980s, it was It was dominant. And I think what caused that was the rational expectations hypothesis focused attention on the Fisher effect in a way that it hadn't. In general, I think the moral here is that lying behind what you are doing, there is the narrative of how academic economics was developing. I won't go on an orgy of self-advertisement now, I'll shut up. But the history of economic thought is sometimes important, and I think it is here. Thank you.
I completely agree. I think you're totally right on both points. There's a way that we can try to think about the 1920s or the really early period of the sample and how we can perhaps use the keywords to identify the same idea. And likewise, there's a strong correlation between what's reported in the media and what people know, particularly what academic economists have developed over time and the models they've used. And that's just gets translated in the media.
Go ahead.
David's point is actually really important because in his examples of the earlier period, they already had a causal idea. By calling it inflation, they were thinking money leads to higher prices, I think, the quantity theory.
I wouldn't overdo the quantity theory. I mean, Friedman, 1968, made such a big fuss about interest rates don't measure the stance of monetary policy. Somebody had to be saying that interest rates measure the stance of monetary policy.
Yeah. Oh, very good points. Okay, so what do we do? Here's a specification. So this is from the Michigan survey, monthly, standardized every variable. Left-hand side is all household expectations. I'll also do some demographic cuts. Both 1 year forward and then 5 to 10 years forward, so long-term and short-term. Common intercept, and it's controlling for the lagged inflation expectations because these tend to be persistent. Optimize the lags to minimize AIC, which is just to think about model parsimony. Lagged realized inflation, that's the one fundamental we have. We can add more, but that's the one that we have here to think about because we know that realized inflation does tend to impact expectations. Controlling for inflation news is the log number of inflation sentences. It's like the intensive margin. And then finally, the shares, putting them all in together, the narrative shares in the previous month.
Controlling for, I would think the total number isn't the right units. You'd want share of all articles that talk about inflation or something.
Yeah, so this difference between extensive versus intensive margin we're thinking about. And so we could easily do at the article level and then just wait by.
You don't even have a balanced panel of newspapers.
We don't, no.
So then John's point is doubly forceful.
Why share and then controlling for the total amount? Why not just the share of narrative K in total articles?
Right, we could do that as well.
Get rid of the delta coefficient. That's essentially.
Yeah, we could do that as well. What we have, again, is not by no means causal, and there you can argue there's also some reverse causality where these newspapers are thinking about or looking at people's inflation expectations, trying to cater to them, and hence they write their narratives a particular way. So what do we find? So first off, this is just 3 models where it's just very simple. It just lagged realized inflation on inflation expectations. It's a little bit hard to see in the color here, but it is significant. It's a 0.064. These are standardized. Those are T-stats in brackets, 1.65. What's interesting is that you still get positive shock to inflation. You get higher inflation expectations. What is interesting is that when we ended the sample in February, it was a much stronger coefficient. But when we extended it to October, it shrank. And so perhaps inflation expectation become a little bit decoupled from realized inflation. And then much less so for long-term inflation, where you have virtually no impact on at least one lagged. Inflation sentences or just inflation news tends to predict higher inflation expectations. It's more coverage, though it's not statistically significant. And then when we think about all the narratives, some do show up where particularly expectations or self-fulfilling expectations seem to predict higher expectations or purchase and savings, both near and long term. Others don't really show up in terms of predicting inflation expectations 1 month ahead. Now, if we think about another factor, so this is at the national level, think about belief dispersion, which is just the variance of people's expectations, how dispersed beliefs are in the Michigan survey. What you see is that certain narratives, particularly social political consequences of inflation, do tend to strongly predict inflation expectations, almost to a degree beyond just the past realized inflation. Whereas there's greater uncertainty or greater dispersion in beliefs about what inflation is going to be 1 month ahead and also 5 to 10 years ahead.
Some sense of which of these you might expect. So I can tell a story that if I learn, it's fiscal policy, it's not just relative prices, that might say, that raises my expectation. I'm just making up that story. Are there any stories you can tell about which ones do affect? Which causal stories about what just happened affect my expectations going forward, and does it line up that way?
I can come up with stories. So for example, rates is a negative coefficient. It's not significant, but you can think there that if there's more discussion about what the Fed will do, that will influence people's expectations go downward. They're going to expect low inflation because they think the Fed is going to react. I would imagine a lot of these are working through policy, perhaps, where maybe some of them where if they see evidence or in the news, a lot of intense information about what the policy of the government, either the Fed or the fiscal policy will do, that could influence their inflation expectations or expectations just or cost of living, the salience of it, they think it might persist. We don't have a good, it's hard to, without a model, a formal mathematical model, it's hard to give a good causal mechanism of why exactly some narratives.
Models formalize words.
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
Good enough here.
Yeah. So this belief dispersion, you see some of the social political consequences of it, why it's increasing the belief dispersion about inflation expectations. What's interesting here is that more of the juice seems to be coming from lower income households. This is just cutting to lower income, the first quartile, where expectations and social political narratives alongside coverage, just pure coverage on inflation seems to impact their inflation expectations more. Sorry that the number is so small. Less so for higher income.
Would that be because the news media is pitching its story to the broad audience of low-income people?
It's quite possible, yeah. Or higher income folks also get signals from other places besides just the media.
Yeah, but that was your interpretation at the beginning. But the causal relationship could be the opposite. Low-income people see the gas prices up, the food prices are up. The media sees the gas prices are up, and so the media says the public's going to think that way, so let's write the story that way, because that way the audience will believe our story.
I think that could absolutely be at play. There are many economic models about the media landscape and how they cater to readers in order to get readership and to increase their supply.
Well, that's their motive.
Exactly, yeah. So I think that's why there is this reverse causality story, which is that they're seeing the expectations and then as they write their articles in a way to cater to audiences, which we can't untangle without a model or some side of exogenous shock to do it.
But in the business cycle, fluctuations in inflation are different for low-income households. My student, Jake Orchard, had a paper that really documented this, and some other people also talked about it.
Yeah, and also the inflation effects are very different for low-income versus high-income households.
Yeah, so, that's what I mean is the inflation and what happens during recessions and expansions for low versus.
Because the inflation they may be expecting is not rational or irrational. It's just the inflation's going to hit them.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Alex, on this point about the incentives of the media, could you ever get PBS transcripts if there's a nonprofit? So television, PBS News is the truth. That was a joke. But as a nonprofit of what they're.
No, they're maximizing donation. So you want to find out maybe what the donor wants or the donor thinks.
That's typically been done, which is the death of an owner. Use that as an exogenous shock to a shift in what people or what the media is reporting, that newspaper is reporting. We don't have too many of those, unfortunately. It's but that's another thing we can think about. And it's not clear whether most of that is about political slant. It's not clear how it's going to translate to shifts in narratives. I mean, it could, but we would have to go down that angle.
Television instead of the news? Is the news elite relative to television?
No, more recent period, I would argue that social media and television are probably more predominant. The data, we can explore it, but I think that's definitely an avenue for that deserves just looking at TV, radio, and particularly social media. The social media one is hard to get that kind of data and how it's influencing people's expectations. Higher income, like I mentioned, or maybe a little bit less so of an impact. Nothing really kicks in except maybe rates, where there's more sensitivity perhaps to what the Fed will do in terms of shifting higher income folks. This is the highest quartile of income, their expectations, and less sensitivity in the news. But bigger impact actually on just realized inflation, more of a sensitivity to that. So the takeaways, I'd say overall, this is all correlation, not causation by any means, but certain narratives do seem to have predictive power above and beyond inflation coverage or just the news and lagged realized inflation. There's differences in narrative sensitivity by household income groups, and some narratives predict greater dispersion in beliefs over others. Okay, the remaining time, about 10 minutes, to talk about the Fed. The same structure. Why the Fed? To some, it's probably obvious, but Fed communications are a core policy tool now, particularly designed to shape expectations. They're in the inflation expectation shaping business. But the Fed does struggle to reach households. And I mentioned this Koybin-shaped e-paper. They actually ran this experiment. They showed Fed statements. They showed the USA Today's coverage of that. The Fed statements did have an effect, but it was small. And the media effects of what the Fed said was half of that. And so like the optimal monetary policy communication tool is still sort of unclear. And if the Fed wants to communicate to the public, it has to understand that its message is going to be filtered through the media. And so how we think about that interplay between what the Fed says and what the media reports. And it could, and communication could give different signals to different audiences based on, let's say, income or other observables. So what we do, it's the same narrative extraction like I mentioned. Again, just look at we downloaded all the Fed statements. I'm sorry, all the Fed documents, but we're focusing on, in this exercise, transcripts, minutes, statements, press conferences, speeches, testimony, and press releases. About 10,000 public-facing documents by the same taxonomy as did before, and we just sort of compare the two. What does the Fed and then the media? You saw the media. And the nice thing here is that we also have the speaker. So we can ask, and there are other questions we can ask, how have the Fed's inflation narratives evolved over time? How much does the Fed narratives pass through to newspapers? Are they amplified or suppressed? And does the Fed's narrative composition predict inflation expectation directly, like we saw to some extent the media narratives do? So these are some examples, like again, like before, cause and effects. These are just statements from different monetary policy figures. So Jerome Powell's there, Lisa Cook, for let's say fiscal. Quarrel said demand augmented by unprecedented fiscal stimulus has been outstripping a temporarily disrupted supply, leading to high inflation. That'd be a cause. Statement from the Fed policymaker of a cause. Let's pick another one.
I'm shocked not to see Fed policy mistakes here.
Acknowledgement of Fed. I think there was a Jerome, maybe not this one. Rate or uncertainty, Don Cohn, higher inflation, interacting with policymaker constraint or policymaker, forgive me, it's small, on inflation's triggers higher expected interest rates and more uncertainty about the long-term future. And so here, to Steve's earlier point, exploiting the speaker, the chairperson at the time, being really high frequency, we haven't done yet. It's still just monthly stuff. But that's the nice thing about the Fed data is that it is very rich. You have a lot of information beyond just the sentences. You have the speaker and the context. Yeah,
so
question?
Nowadays, like Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, they have usually often a team of writers just dedicated to reporting on the Fed. Was that something that's always been the case? Or when did that start, and does that have any?
I imagine it wasn't always the case.
Maybe David knows.
But I can look into it more. I would imagine.
I wonder if there's some break there that you see. Do they talk about different topics, since that's a different audience that would be reading those Fed-specific writers?
Right. Yeah. I think that, I guess the amplification results I'll show you, and whether there's a domain shift there. But I have to look into if there's an exact date where it became a standard practice to really have a Fed desk. Okay, so this is just the inflation sentences. Again, the same strategy. Look at all these Fed documents, extract sentences that have the word inflation. It's sparser by a lot. We go back as far as the public-facing Fed documents go, which is 1937. It's all by release date because some of these are delayed by 5 years, particularly the transcripts. This is monthly count, but also 12-month rolling average. You also see similar patterns around particular episodes, post-COVID when they adopted the formula, the 2% inflation target.
Boy, the Fed used to keep its mouth shut.
Yeah.
Is this number or
this is number? This is number, so it's not scaling.
So what's the percentage?
No, but this is one Fed, so the number actually, unlike the newspapers,
exactly. Yeah,
number,
there's no compositional change. Yeah,
right. But if the Fed just does a few things,
number of inflation sentences, so it's not accounting for the number of sentences. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can, since we have the full data. Okay, and this is all causes, all effects. And so in contrast to the media, there's more of an emphasis on causes when it comes to the Fed, less on effects. It is much more sparse up until 1975, where there was a more open communication policy. Less so on effects. A big run-up I'll show you is going to be monetary. Switching to the most prevalent ones, monetary, supply, and fiscal, the same three that were the case for the media.
So the Fed is acknowledging that monetary policy is the main cause of inflation in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there is we screwed up languages.
Go back to the one that just shows the sentences
Oh, this one
about
here.
inflation. It's also revealing in that it actually drops off very sharply in the pandemic,
Yeah.
suggesting the Fed was not so concerned about inflation.
Modern monetary theory.
Oh,
We
yes.
we want to spend as much money as we can
Right.
because otherwise we'll have deflation.
Yes. Yes. Well, yeah, well, that's a reason to check for deflation too. See how worried they were then in the GFC deflation. But it is striking in light of what happened inflation later that they were so seemingly unconcerned about it. during
See that
quarantine.
in the media too?
There's a slight drop off and then a big spike. This is a much sharper drop off.
But Steve, your point is excellent because you're
Yeah.
seeing it also 2008.
Yeah.
We go to zero, low inflation, zero bound. We're not
Yeah.
worried about inflation.
Yeah.
That's because
But
a
they're-
Democrat has come into office. So when a Democrat comes into office, the media no longer, the Fed is no longer listening. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but for the financial crisis, I think deflation you see more pickup there because there's about deflation. Okay, so this is just like I showed you, monetary fiscal supply, supply gaining more prominence a little bit later, but monetary being the most prevalent, then dropping. Effects, again, sparse in the early periods, picking in more in the 1970s, 1980s. Rates, savings, uncertain. Rates and savings were the same as the media. Uncertain was not. For the media, it was the cost of living. That was the most prevalent effect, at least the third most prevalent effect. You see a spike up post-COVID about just talking about rates.
But with the rise, I'm surprised with the rise of forward guidance, you're not seeing even more. You know, the next sentence after inflation is high is we're going to tighten interest rates.
Now, this is just thinking about pass-through, the last, I guess, minute or so, pass-through about the media and the Fed. And this is just standardizing the media narratives in solid and the Fed narratives in dash. And this is monetary and rates. And they tend to be co-integrated, but not one for one, where there's some deviation. And if you think about pass-through, which is just thinking about the media share, regressing on a lagged media share, and then the Fed share, and then controlling for lagged inflation, is how much of these Fed narratives pass through to the media, at least on a share basis. This is aggregating all narratives, not one by one. And so you can have a narrative fixed effect. What you get is thinking about the coefficients. Beta is sort of the average media response. And then you can think about the long-term effect by aggregating these over time. You get suppression. So it's not a full pass-through one for one. It's, it's a little bit modified. And it has a little smaller impacts. And then you can think about, I'll just skip this narrative by narrative, but this is sort of the incremental R squared. How much more of an explanation does adding the Fed narrative do to the R squared if you just progress it on the lags and inflation? And when the Fed talks about monetary, cause that tends to pass through more toward the media. The final bit, I just have over time, we run the same regressions, but thinking about directly Fed communications and household expectations. I'll just skip through this and just show you the takeaways, which is ending here, which is that the Fed has more of a muted response in terms of predicting inflation expectations compared to the media, which is slightly in conflict to the JP paper that looked at Fed communications and just media articles about the same Fed news, but they weren't looking at stories or inflation. But overall, what we do or we ask is really how have inflation narratives evolved in American media, particularly newspapers, and Fed communications over the past 100 years, and do they predict inflation expectations? Well, we find the media tends to attenuate Fed narratives, and some newspaper framings do actually have some predictive power for inflation expectations beyond realized inflation. And then why it matters is what media reports and how, not just what the Fed says, may be as important for anchoring inflation expectations. But thank you very much. Again, this is early stage work, and so write for feedback and on some excellent points. Really appreciate all the comments.